welcome everybody. In way of quick intros and some background and context, for about the last year, Corey on our team has been doing a weekly cybersecurity executive brief where we scour all the headlines and do a lot of research each week and then try to come up with a 15-minute executive summary to share with our CISO and security community. Corey and team does a lot of work on that. And we thought an interesting thing to do would be to share kind of the trends. What did we learn over the last year? And based on what we've learned and all the assessments that we've performed, what do we think is going to happen into next year? So, our head of offensive security, Corey Wolf, well over 20 years experience, a core team member at Red Team Village at DEF CON. Just great guy, if I may say so myself, Corey. So thank you for doing this. I'll hand it off to you, Corey. We're excited to hear about the trends this year.
Appreciate it. So, like Christian had mentioned, my name is Corey Wolf, Director of Offensive Security at Risk 360. As you can imagine, my team is responsible for all the penetration testing, red teaming, all that kind of good stuff that comes with technical testing. As Christian had mentioned, we do a weekly cybersecurity executive brief, which is on YouTube and LinkedIn. You're welcome to join that. There's some links that we'll drop in the chat there for you to check it out. That comes out every Wednesday on LinkedIn and YouTube. And because of that, we are able to start to really put together a little bit of year in review, right? And so that's what we're going to do here today. One of the big things, you can't talk about 2024 without talking about AI. When we think about AI, when all this first started, the big concern was, oh no, AI is going to, within a year or two, there's going to be fully autonomous systems that can completely, start to exploit 0 days or, just set it free, and it's just going to attack and be able to do things that humans can't. And I'm sure that that's still going to happen at some point, but which happens with most things, it was kind of boring for all intents and purposes. What threat actors did with AI was really use it to improve their phishing emails and landing pages used in social engineering campaigns. Social engineering, tried and true technique, but that's really where we've seen the bulk of AI in 2024 and probably will, at least for a little bit. The next step above that is deepfake audio and video. And so we did actually see 2 real world attacks in 2024 with deepfake AI, where in a couple of situations, there were this original one really started from a business email compromise. So in this case, $25 million was paid out to threat actors after that. Those threat actors put together a convincing story to get a person on the line. So someone who's responsible for being able to actually send payments. They coerced this person into sending a $25 million payment. And this person thought it was a little suspect, but jumped on a call and saw, I believe it was like 6 or 7 of their peers on this call looked like the people they should look like, who sounded like the people that they should look like, and ultimately sent the payment. So there were a couple pretexts. So if you think about social engineering, one of the big things with the pretext is urgency or secrecy or whatever, right? You definitely want to coerce urgency. And that's what they did here. They messaged this worker saying that a secret payment needed to be made, and got this worker onto a call and used deepfake AI to convince them that he was actually talking to the CFO and made that payment. Those threat actors actually received that payment. This was only noticed after the worker followed up with corporate after the fact, but it's happening, and it happened in 2024. It's probably going to increase. Another time where this happened was where a senator was targeted by threat actors, and the senator, Senator Cardin, had multiple calls with the Ukrainian Foreign Affairs Minister, and a call was set up with Senator Cardin here. And when he joined the Zoom call, it was just like any other Zoom call. However, it sounded just like the Foreign Affairs Minister. It looked just like the Foreign Affairs Minister. However, it was not the Foreign Affairs Minister. And I believe they only realized it once the questions and the asks were just started to become a little bit more demanding. And I guess it says politically charged questions related to the upcoming election. It's real. It's happening. The bulk of what we saw in 2024 and probably will in 2025 was related to just classic phishing emails because they're able to make the English much better. They're able to relate to things that are English speaking people might understand, right? They're just able to do it much better. And not only that, but they can generate the phishing landing pages much better. So wanted to start off with AI because you have to, right? You have to. 2024 is the age of AI, and while we are not yet at the point where Skynet is out there just going for it, we are starting to see advances in that, and we'll expect that to continue. But can't talk about 2024 without talking about AI, and figure that was a good place to start. If we look a little bit more, one thing that we do pretty much a couple times a month is that we take a look at ransomware, what ransomware crews are up to, what they're doing. As you can see here in 2024, there was a total of 5,174 victims of ransomware. Let's make a side note on this. Some of these victims are random WordPress websites. Some of them can be, which kind of stinks, they're small, like Etsy shops or things like that. I'd say probably half of them are one person, two person type shops that just simply don't understand security. But I'd say probably the other half, somewhere around 2,000, 2,500 of them, 100 of them are medium-sized businesses or greater, right? And so even if we cut that 5,000 number in half to 2,500, that's a lot of victims. And as you can see here, Ransom Hub and Lockbit were the two busiest in 2024. Ransom Hub claimed 728 victims of their ransomware strain. Lockbit, there was a lot going on in 2024 with Lockbit and the leader of that particular crew. If There was a lot of back and forth between the federal government and Lockbit. The federal government, well, it was a joint task force between US, UK, and I believe New Zealand, but they took down quite a bit of Lockbit's infrastructure. So for us as security researchers, what we'll do is these ransomware crews, if you're not aware, these ransomware crews have blogs just like any other business would. And they're of course on the Tor network. They're on the deep web, the dark web. But you can visit them and they'll post updates about their victims, about affiliates, you name it, right? And so one of the things that this joint task force did with Lockbit in 2024 was they took down a big piece of their infrastructure. So their blogs were not accessible. Ransomware crews have affiliates. So they have affiliate programs. Those were down for Lockbit. Supposedly there were decryption keys that the task force had obtained in some way or another. And everyone thought Lockbit was done. Lockbit in 2023 was probably the busiest. They've probably made the most amount of money. And to give you context, in 2022, for example, there's a ransomware crew called Conti, which made roughly $250 million in 2022. So that's the last good data I can find. But to give you an idea of the size and scope of these ransomware crews, they're making real money. And so Lockbit in 2023 was probably the busiest, we would say. And they had quite a year. One other crew, so we'll call it Ransom Hub. So Change Healthcare was a big attack in 2024. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a bit. But Change Healthcare had a ransomware incident. And this was taken on by Black Cat / Alpha V. It's another group, right? And these ransomware crews have affiliates. So anyone can basically sign up to be an affiliate and use that ransomware crew's infrastructure, tooling, whatever. They basically gain initial access and then they'll use that ransomware as a service to then, perform ransomware attacks on that organization that they've gained access to. But Ransom Hub was responsible for the initial access to Change Healthcare, and they were using Black Cat's ransomware as a service. So what happens in this situation is Ransom Hub did probably half the lifting. But when payments are made, they go to the ransomware as a service, which in this case was Black Hat. Black Hat took that payment. Change Healthcare did make a payment. I believe it was $26 million. Black Hat took that payment and ran, and that was it. And so Ransom Hub was not very happy about this. Of course, they didn't get their payout. I believe Change Healthcare made a second payment because Ransom Hub were threatening to release the data. But the point is that Ransom Hub got burned by Black Hat. They were not happy about it, and subsequently went on an absolute tear. So as you can see, roughly, even cut that in half, 350. If you cut Ransom Hub in half, that's quite a lot of that's a lot of work. So no doubt that in 2024, Ransom Hub was probably one of the biggest ransomware crews. Lockbit, everyone thinks Lockbit is gone, and it's like you always think that they're done for. Like, how could they come back from this? They did actually come back from that joint task force. Their infrastructure is back in place, and it's business as usual for them. Just a little bit about ransomware and what's been going on in 2024. Ransomware is expected. Ransomware, as far as ransom payments go, has went over $1 billion in 2024. So over $1 billion has been paid to ransomware crews in 2024 alone. We'll see if that continues, but you never know. As far as some things that we really saw, like trends and different things that we saw in 2024. Some of the big ones are zero day exploits. So I just threw up I know there's a lot of text. I normally don't like to put up this much text in a slide, but as you can see in the 2024 CISA Joint Advisory, they call out malicious cyber actors exploited more zero-day vulnerabilities to compromise enterprise networks in 2023 compared to 2022. And then it goes on to say the trend of zero-day exploitation has continued into 2024, according to Britain's NCSC, marking a shift from 2022 when less than half of the top list was initially exploited as zero-day vulnerabilities. So in that second quote there, a shift from 2022 when less than half of the top list was initially exploited as zero-day vulnerabilities. What that is saying is that in 2022 and before, traditionally what we saw was simply just unpatched systems or old legacy software being out there in the wild. And basically, if it's old or it's not maintained and we're not updating, we're not patching, of course, there's lots of exploits out there. But what we're starting to see now is more and more zero days being used out in the wild. And I guess that's a testament to cybersecurity as a whole and how we've done in implementing in updating rather our processes and all that kind of good stuff. Because if threat actors and nation states need to work and use 0 days more and more, that means that we're doing our job, right? So hopefully that's a good thing. But what that means is that because a nation state, anyone who has a 0 day, for example, they're not just going to burn it on anything unless they have to, right? And if they're burning all these 0 days, it's just more and more showing that they can't get around, in traditional ways. So it would appear as though we're doing a better job of maintaining our systems. Not using nearly as much legacy software. Can't speak necessarily for the telecoms, which we'll talk about that in a bit. But one of the big areas that we saw in 2024 get hit were network security devices. So things like firewalls, VPNs, that kind of thing. And I pulled up CSO Online has a pretty good write up here about what we actually saw getting hit in 2024. And if you can see, it's like Avanti, Connect Secure, Fortinet, Palo Alto PAN-OS, which is their firewall and their network gateways and that kind of stuff. Cisco ASAs. You can see this is all just essentially what would be referred to as perimeter security devices. And this really started to take off in COVID. So when COVID happened, everybody went back to work. There was a big uptick in vulnerabilities and exploits against VPN devices, for example, because everybody went remote and organizations had to quickly figure out a way to get everybody online so they could work. So threat actors, of course, took advantage of that and really started to hit network appliances much more. That trend has continued for a number of reasons. Maybe they just weren't looking at them nearly as much, although for quite some time, the NSA has put out all kinds of advisories and documentation about why SSL VPN, for example, the NSA specifically calls out SSL VPNs, why they are a security nightmare and you basically shouldn't use them. But the other reason is that if you look at a lot of these devices, Fortinet's, the Cisco stuff, a lot of it's running old code or code that it has had just layers put on top, one after another. And so if you're a threat actor and you want to exploit one of these, and you can get your hands on one of them, well, all you really have to do is pull the firmware off, basically reverse engineer it. Unfortunately, it's not too difficult, we'll say, for threat actors to identify vulnerabilities in these types of devices. In many ways, they'd be considered legacy devices. So you've seen quite an uptick in these items being targeted. Like the Fortinet one, for example, is Fortinet is running like PHP. I forget. I'm not going to say because I can't remember exactly, but some old version of PHP that has vulnerabilities. And it's that's just kind of par for the course for these types of devices. So we've definitely seen them get attacked more and more, and threat actors have been very good at this. If you remember hearing about Move It, which I think Move It was technically in 2023, but Move It was a file transfer appliance, which had a 0 day, which can't remember exactly which crew had that one, but a ransomware crew developed their own O-Day and basically mass exploited it throughout the internet. But definitely more 0 days. This is, I think, an example even more of Microsoft. So, for example, in October of 2024, in one update, Patch Tuesday update, Microsoft addressed 5 0-day vulnerabilities, and so two of them, as you can see in this headline here, were actively and probably still are, but were actively exploited, and that's pretty big for them to patch five. I mean, there's usually one or two, right? I mean, but for them to have five in one patch update, that's a big deal. And also, it says, the update is the third largest so far this year in terms of disclosed CVEs after April's 147 and July's set of 139. So October had 117 updates and the Patch Tuesday update. April, 147 CVEs. That is a lot of work. To kind of jump to the other side of that, Google Chrome had a bunch of 0 days this year. This is from May of 2024, but they had to patch numerous vulnerabilities in Chrome this year. Again, if you think about how things work nowadays, we've gotten so good at securing and defending the endpoint, but nowadays, like 90% of our work is done through the browser, right? And so, yeah, sure, there's other stuff. Maybe we're using Excel or Word or whatever, but like 90% of the stuff we do as employees of our employer is through the browser. And so naturally threat actors are going to see that and understand that. Threat actors, unfortunately, are some of the most innovative people and thoughtful people that you'll come across. Their intentions aren't great, but they are, you got to admit they are innovative and they do think through how to gain access to the things they want to gain access to. And so Chrome was another big target in 2024 and will probably continue to be as time goes on. So 0 days were definitely pushed much more in 2024. I call it out quickly, Move It, even though that was from 2023. I believe it's from 2023, but definitely seeing more. 0 days are getting more and more expensive as well for threat actors and nation states to gain to identify, but they have to use them more, and so we're seeing more and more of that happen. So another trend is state-sponsored threats. So Vault Typhoon, Fancy Bear, a big one that happened in well, for those of you that are not aware, Vault Typhoon and Salt Typhoon are Chinese nation state threat actor groups. So nation state APTs, advanced persistent threats. And in January of 2024, Microsoft identified. So let's step back. There's lots of different groups with lots of different names. Midnight Blizzard, for example, is Microsoft's naming scheme for threat actors. So I just mentioned Volt Typhoon, it's Salt Typhoon. That's Microsoft's naming convention. When you hear Typhoon, that's Chinese nation state. With Microsoft, when you hear Blizzard, that's Russian nation state. In this case, in January of 2024, Microsoft identified that Midnight Blizzard, aka the Russian SVR, had gained access to their corporate tenant. We actually did a training session on this in March of 2024, but Microsoft had discovered that they had gained access to their corporate tenant. And this was kind of a big deal. Midnight Blizzard, aka the Russian SVR, aka Fancy Bear. Side note: there is a resolution out there. I believe it's through the Internet Engineering Task Force to standardize a naming convention of threat actors, because Microsoft calls it one thing, CrowdStrike calls them another, etc. So, just side note, I would look into that if you're interested in that kind of thing. But I'll move on. Side note over. So, at the end of the day, Russian SVR had gained access to a Microsoft corporate tenant and had access. In Microsoft's write up, they talked through, kind of how the attack happened. Microsoft didn't clearly state what kind of permissions the threat actors would need to have or would actually gain. But due to their write up, we know that the Russian SVR, just compared to Microsoft's own admission into what the threat actors did, is the SVR had to have had global admin rights or better. They were in Microsoft's corporate environment with global, maybe not specifically global admin, but equivalent global admin, and for months. And so Microsoft didn't realize that. And another attack in 2024, I believe it was Salt Typhoon, also gained access to a Microsoft signing key for token generation. So what they could essentially do was they could create a valid authentication token for, I believe, any Microsoft service, and they use that as well. I believe that was Salt Typhoon. But we saw a lot of nation state activity in 2024. Maybe it's always been there, but maybe we're just hearing about it more. But if we talk through a couple more of these big ones, the CISA has put out in 2024, they put out quite a bit advisories related to either Salt Typhoon or Volt Typhoon, Chinese nation state APTs. And probably the biggest one this year was when the telecom firms just completely, it's bad. It was bad. What had happened is that the Volt Typhoon had gained access to not only T-Mobile, AT&T, Verizon, I think one other network. I can't remember which one, but 8 or 9 U.S. telecommunications networks, and had sat in there for quite some time. They had access to call records, billing information, you name it. One of the items that they really wanted to hone in on was, so if you're a telecommunication provider, you need to have lawful intercept programs, right? So if there's a warrant for a wiretap, you need to be able to provide that to the government. And so these telecommunications companies have different applications and methods to track all this lawful intercept documentation. And so one of the thoughts there was that they wanted to go after that so that they could possibly identify, certain spies or intelligence activities. I'm not sure how true that was, but the point is that they did have a pretty broad scope into the telecommunications networks of the United States. They had that access, I believe, at least for 5 or 6 months. And again, they had hit 8 or 9 different providers, telecommunications providers. This is when the FBI, which funny because for so many years the FBI has had a pretty strong stance. Well, intelligence in general and law enforcement in general have had a pretty strong stance about not about pushing back against end-to-end encrypted messaging, because of course, they can't intercept it, right? Which makes sense. But they had always been against it. And then as this attack came out in 2024 and we started to learn more and more and more, it actually got to the point where the FBI recommended that people use encrypted messaging apps, which is just absolutely crazy to hear them do that. I mean, it must have been bad, right? But this is one other big trend in 2024. State-sponsored threats have absolutely 100% increased. There's various reasons for that. it depends on the agenda of that particular country, but we have seen quite an increase in state-sponsored attacks. So that would be probably the number two biggest trend that we saw in 2024. As far as number three, it's really based around cloud security and issues that happen with not just Microsoft. So, for example, we just talked about Microsoft's corporate tenant being accessed in 2024 by Fancy Bear, Midnight Blizzard, aka Russian SVR. The way that they gained access to that corporate tenant was something called service principal abuse. So there was a test tenant that belonged to Microsoft, which the threat actors gained access to one way or another. We believe there's credential stuffing, but they gained access to that test tenant and then used a cloud privilege escalation technique known as service principal abuse. So they went from a test tenant into the Microsoft corporate tenant. And that was there because of cloud misconfigurations. So, yes, we're talking about that type of cloud, but there's lots of other things in that could be related to, cloud. And one of those, probably the biggest, Snowflake. Snowflake was a pretty big one. Major clients of Snowflake, including AT&T. AT&T had a rough year, apparently. But AT&T, Ticketmaster, Santander Bank, there's a bunch of them, had their data accessed by threat actors. So this one, there was a lot of hype about, there was a lot of talk about. Snowflake was breached. That's not what happened. So Snowflake itself as a whole did not have an incident. So if those of us familiar with the shared responsibility model of cloud, what happened here was these Snowflake instances were not properly configured. So there was no MFA on the accounts, the game that allowed access. Snowflake actually has some pretty good documentation, which I think I pulled up. Yeah, Snowflake has some pretty good documentation about securing your Snowflake tenant, which includes things like network restrictions. So, for example, we will do at Risk 360, we'll do Snowflake secure configuration reviews, and we'll walk through a whole bunch of stuff that you should be doing. One of those things is restricting rather access to your tenant. So you can do this by IP. You can hook it into your Azure Entra ID rather, and block who can even access it. So you can put network restrictions in place. In this case, there were at least 165 customers of Snowflake that had an account that had credentials that were either in breach data, or one of the big ones that happened with this specifically was something called info stealers. Info stealers are another big trend that we're seeing. It's a piece of malware that sits on the device and literally just gathers info. Doesn't do anything except just listen and look, right? It'll gather things. If you enter a username and password into a website, it'll gather that and ship it off to the threat actor C2. If there's cookies, they're sensitive cookies, it'll send those off. Session tokens, all that kind of thing. And so the threat actors gathered a whole bunch of username and password pairs for Snowflake instances. And that means that these 165 customers had accounts with either breached or leaked credentials in some way. They did not have MFA enabled, and they did not have network segmentation. I keep saying segmentation, network restrictions in place, as well as a host of other things that Snowflake themselves call out. So I guess, it's kind of a 50-50. I guess maybe you would think that like a Snowflake, for example, would require MFA. But again, their stance at the time was that, it's shared responsibility. We have this documentation as far as securing your instance, but we haven't, you need to implement it, right? And so that was a pretty big one. A lot of data was sent out there, and there was a lot of talk about this one, but it wasn't a breach of Snowflake. It was more of the Snowflake instances being misconfigured or improperly configured. So another big trend is cloud security incidents and or breaches, although Snowflake was not a breach. But enough. I've belabored that point. Anyways, some other big things that happened. Of course, we talked about AI in the beginning here. I just couldn't wait. I had to talk about AI, but Another big trend is AI in quantum computing in 2024. So we just talked through some of those AI attacks. The deepfakes are getting better. The audio is getting better. Deepfake video getting better. There's actually interesting research from, oh man, I'm so sorry, I can't remember who it was, but they took, there's a security researcher named Elise Dennis who is big on social engineering. Her focus is social engineering, physical pen testing, that kind of thing. And what they did was they took, so she does lots of videos. And so they took a lot of these videos of her and fine tuned an audio machine learning model and in real time demonstrated that, I can sit here as Corey Wolf and using various means have it show as me being someone else, through video in real time. Man, I wish if I can remember, I wish I could find that. It's really interesting research and they gave a good talk. But AI, of course, is big. Quantum computing. So, as you can see here, Chinese researchers break RSA encryption with quantum computer. And so this is true. And actually, when we talked about this, a few months back, one of the big things that came back, which kind of we talked about a little bit, but this quantum computing breaking cryptography is like probably the biggest concern and has been the biggest concern about quantum computers. What those people or those nation states with the resources to do so can essentially right now we kind of have the ability to break encryption, but what they can do is they can just sit on all this encrypted data. So all the traffic that goes across the internet, 90% of the traffic that goes across the internet is encrypted, and so they can't intercept it and see what the contents are. So the thought is that nation states or advanced adversaries are just sitting on this data, collecting a whole bunch of it, waiting for the time when quantum computing allows them to break that encryption mechanism that we use today. And so if quantum computers were able to break encryption, that's kind of a big deal. And so they did. However, they did it with very small bit lengths. So I'm not going to even attempt to act like I'm an expert in cryptography. That is way above my head. But the point is that there's various bit lengths for encryption keys. Typically, it's 2048, 4096 bits, right? And so what this quantum computer did was they cracked they broke an encryption algorithm using the RSA algorithm, but it was only 22 bits, which is extremely small by today's standards. Is it an immediate threat? Probably not, but they're getting there. And the fact matters that they actually did it. Before they haven't done it, right? Now they actually did it. Yes, it's a very small bit length, but that will increase. And so this is a big deal because this is kind of one of those things that me as a security person, I've always thought about and I've been concerned about. And it's a little bit it's a little bit it makes me a little worried, right? But the good news about that is that NIST, in their infinite wisdom, has been working on post quantum encryption standards for quite some time. And in August of 2024, they released their final set of encryption tools designed to withstand the attack of a quantum computer. So perfect timing. Good old NIST coming through. So this is a project that, if you're not familiar, was it RSA or SHA? I don't remember which one. A lot of the encryption standards that we use today came from actually a program. I think it was NIST. It was either NIST or the NSA, but a government program that was basically a competition. So all these different mathematicians essentially put together their proposal for cryptography algorithms in the 80s, I think, early 90s. And because, NIST and the government and various other people much smarter than me knew that we were going to need to do this in the 80s and 90s, we need to encrypt it. And so they put together a competition of sorts for encryption algorithms. And I can't remember if it's SHA or I don't think it was RSA. Maybe it was. But that's how we got the first round of encryption algorithms that we use today. And so NIST, in their infinite wisdom here, has for probably a decade now, long time, at least 8 years, knew that this was coming and had started the process to identify and foster the creation of post quantum encryption standards. So funny timing. In 2024, yes, a quantum computer for the first time did break an RSA encryption algorithm. And subsequently, NIST released their finalized post-quantum encryption standards. So the government, and like I said, people much smarter than I, have been thinking about this for a while now. And good news. Well, we think we're there. We think that we've figured out a way to kind of mitigate that threat. But remember, a threat actor or a concerted nation state could sit on terabytes of encrypted data, wait for the time to come, and who knows, maybe they'll find something. I'm sure they would. I'm sure they'd find something good. So that's their hope. They're waiting on the quantum computers to be able to break all the other encryption, and at one point they're going to decrypt it. Right? Yeah, a lot of action in 2024, and we have some pretty big breaches and or security incidents. Some of the biggest ones: Change Healthcare. So Change Healthcare was talked about quite a bit. We talked about it on our weekly executive brief a number of times. This is, of course, if you're not familiar, the United Healthcare subsidiary suffered a ransomware attack. In the beginning of our discussion today, I was talking through Ransom Hub and how they were the ones that gained initial access to Change Healthcare, got burned on the payment, and then tried to get payment again from Change Healthcare. At the time, the estimate was 100 million Americans' information was stolen. Change Healthcare just recently updated that to approximately 190 million Americans. So what's that? One in two, roughly. Roughly 50% of Americans' data was stolen. Change Healthcare. So I go on a lot about attack surface management. Change Healthcare had an exposed Citrix host that was sitting out on the broader internet. Anyone could connect to it and try to sign into it. They had a Citrix host sitting out there that the credentials were taken from breach data. So the threat actors and many security companies, us included, gather breach data so that later on when they go and they want to try something, they'll just take whatever they have from breach data and attempt it. And so the threat actors had a login and password for Change Healthcare that came from breach data. They found the Citrix host. They logged in. There was no MFA, and apparently pretty flat network, meaning that once they got in there, they could pretty much hit everything. Probably lack of network segmentation, that kind of thing. But 190 million Americans' information was leaked due to that ransomware incident. Change Healthcare paid 26 million, and then I think an additional 2 million. But yeah, the other big one, which we talked about all of these, I think, but the telecom companies targeted. I don't think the breadth of this attack is really fully understood. They were in there for quite some time, and this is just a continuation of nation states going after not just us, not just in the U.S., but in general. China, Chinese APTs in particular, have been going after this type of critical infrastructure for quite some time. It might have been 2023, maybe early 2024, but Chinese nation states, again, one of the typhoons, I believe it was Vault Typhoon, had gained access to a communications hub in Guam. And if you were to look at Guam, it sits between Asia and North America, and there's lots of undersea cables. There's lots of trunks that basically go through Guam. And so the thought was at the time that if those threat actors were able to, if they gained access to Guam or the facilities in Guam, they could either, shut down the internet. Well, they wouldn't shut down the internet because there's lots of trunks coming to us, but they could shut down quite a big portion of the traffic coming to North America, and they could, in some instances, monitor it. So this is not new. This has been part of what they've been doing for quite some time now. And this breach of the telecommunications companies is no different. We talked a lot about Snowflake. I'm not gonna belabor that point anymore. But another big one was Ascension Healthcare, and they operate about 140 hospitals across 19 states. This was another ransomware incident from Black Basta, and this was a pretty bad one where they just they were using pen and paper. They couldn't take in ambulances. It was a pretty rough time. But those are some of the biggest ones of this year. Again, we will have a white paper that comes out after this with a little bit more information but wanted to make sure that we hit the high points here today. Yeah, so Change Healthcare, probably the biggest. Not probably, it's definitely the biggest. So as far as emerging threats, what's going to happen here? So in 2025, AI, I think no surprise to anyone. AI will continue to be a concern. Those methods, DeepSeek, we talked about DeepSeek on the weekly brief, which came out yesterday. DeepSeek is a new Chinese model, which is comparative to ChatGPT's I think ChatGPT's is 4.0 right now. The big model is 4.0. They put out a model a week or two, probably a week ago at this point. Point is that AI will continue to be a concern. I don't think anybody has any question about that. We talked a little bit about the 0 days will increase. Yes, they will. And that's because we've in some ways done a very good job of securing the perimeter of our networks. Not just a perimeter, but if you think about, and I mentioned it earlier, if you think about how well protected the endpoints are, I mean, CrowdStrike, as someone who works in OffSec, CrowdStrike's the biggest thorn in my side and probably the biggest thing that I have to overcome and my team has to overcome during an engagement because it's gotten very good. We've gotten very good at securing the endpoints. And so what this means is that, technical controls and process are, more important than ever. So if there is action or there is some sort of incident on a perimeter device or even an endpoint, we need to understand how to quickly mitigate them and go through them. So we think we'll continue to see 0 days increase as we mature as an industry and our processes continue to mature in each individual organization. Identity-based attacks will increase. So we started this off with that AI deepfake. One portion that I didn't cover is that those same threat actors that used those identities in that deepfake video scam where they got 25 million. Not only did they do that, but they used AI to generate the appropriate documentation to get things like bank accounts, get things like passports, all other kinds of identification. Right? They basically used AI to deepfake that person and essentially steal their identity. Not only that, but if you think about identity in the IAM, identity and access management, in the organizational space, in many ways, identity is the new endpoint, right? So identity, everything's SSO, right? Almost everything's SSO. And so if we're able to gain access to that identity in some way or another, we are now verified in all those other places that SSO is enabled. Um, ServiceNow, for example, a lot of places have their AWS account tied in with SSO to Entra, which can be a lot of things. Uh, Adversarial initiative is just getting started. I think I kind of made that point. Something to remember: Windows playing end of life for Windows 10 in 2025. So that means that unless you have an extended, I forget what it's called, extended service plan with Microsoft, it will not receive security updates. It will not receive updates, and so we think that there'll be a lot of activity on Windows 10 from threat actors as different things happen. But do your best to update to Windows 11 if possible. I think pretty much all the new machines that come out nowadays, well, they're issued nowadays, typically have Windows 11 on them anyways. So there's some of the big ones that at least I believe will be something to look for in 2025. And just real quick, before we wrap it up, some actionable strategies for the future. Make sure that you invest in threat intelligence penetration testing. I believe I think Christian can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's the 2022 ISO 27001 that requires threat intelligence activities. Not only does it help with your ISO, but it's just a good thing to do overall. Threat intelligence could be things like dark web monitoring. It could be things like just having a solidified process for ingesting news, industry news, and that kind of stuff. I'm always going to say penetration testing. I'm the director of offensive security. I can't help myself. It is a very good way to identify true vulnerabilities in misconfigurations in networks. So definitely do that because a penetration test, for example, is going to be able to identify those misconfigurations. To change healthcare, I talked a little bit about attack surface management, which is an offshoot of penetration testing. That would have identified that change healthcare instance. It would have seen that there's breach creds. We would have tried to breach creds. We would have been able to tell them. Tighten your SaaS cloud infrastructure. So shared responsibility model. Snowflake has very good documentation. If you have Snowflake, I highly suggest you read up on that documentation and securing your Snowflake instance. Of course, run through incident response. It's one thing to have it's one thing to have a plan, but it's another thing to try it out in, tabletops and that kind of thing. You have some time, but start to think about post quantum cryptography and what you can do with that. And because it's definitely going to be an issue in the coming years. And then, as always, do what you can to enhance employee training and security awareness.
Corey, we got some questions coming through QA. Also, I was hyping as you were talking through AI. I was talking about the work that you did with the AI avatar recently. So even though we don't have the audio working for this webinar, could you flash that? Could you preview? Because I think seeing what you created
I'll
kind of drive the
try.
point home. Maybe you can at least get the video part of it.
So what I did for today was I created an AI deepfake of myself.
Yeah, and just to emphasize, like that is not Corey. That is completely AI generated. It looks and sounds just like Corey, which was really really cool. And if you've seen the weekly cybersecurity executive brief, you're often wearing that shirt, so it's very eerie. So Corey, thanks for sharing that. A couple questions that came through. Lester was asking. He said, "How do you prioritize systems to conduct pen testing when you're advising clients?"
Well, I mean, you got to remember it's a technical control, but it's also a business control. So what's most important to the business? I think a good way to answer that is oftentimes with red teaming, for example, red teaming is objective based. So red teaming is typically full scope. It means, the client basically just tells us what not to do. But other than that, we can pretty much do social engineering, physical, etc. And with red teaming, for example, it's objective based. So if they're some sort of healthcare intermediary that's found some sort of novel way to reduce the time to file claims, and that's an algorithm, for example. I don't know. The objective in a red team engagement would be, well, see if you can gain access to that algorithm. If it's a financial institution, the objective might be, see if you can get access to the Swift terminal. I think as far as prioritizing, you really need to understand what the business is trying to accomplish and do, because for so long, I think technical testing has kind of been seen as a detriment to business enablement, but it's the very opposite. You can use it to help enable the business and help the business remain secure. So I don't necessarily want to get into the weeds of identifying assets and their criticality and that kind of thing, because I could talk about that for an hour. But at the core, what I would say is remember what the objective is. What is the business trying to accomplish? And then you can prioritize from there.
So thanks to everybody for joining. Thank you, Corey.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Hope everybody has a good rest of their day.